Hey Internet, hey YouTube, this is Nate. You can also call me Nathan, but please never call me Nathaniel. And welcome to my introduction and tactical guide on The Last Divinity. This is the new boss, arguably the biggest change that came with the new Last Divinity DLC. And we're going to talk about several different things. One, we're going to talk about who is The Last Divinity. What is the background and lore behind The Last Divinity? We'll be talking about the boss fight itself. What does it consist of? What are the different effects of threat level? And then we'll talk a little bit about how to tactically play The Last Divinity. What this guide is not a build guide. So I'm not going to be talking about specifically how to build for The Last Divinity, but more like, given certain build archetypes, what is my recommendation on how to play those archetypes out tactically in the actual combat. This is going to be again, a little bit more focused on kind of general principles that can be applied. And we're going to look at different threat levels, what it means, how it affects the boss itself, how it affects the units that get spawned. So if you like this video, please subscribe. Hope you're enjoying the content, having a good mix of guide content and standard content. And with that, let's jump into it. So let's start with the background on The Last Divinity. We'll just start with the tooltip. So the lore text is: a divinity still exists, one of space and time. If you are ever to threaten it, it will likely use those powers against you, never allowing you to truly reach your goal. Instead, repeating your struggle over and over. I've looked for a way to broker peace. I've studied all I can, but I've still yet to come up with a solution. And if history is any guide, it may be best that I am not the one to find it. So The Last Divinity represents a culmination of a lot of what is happening behind pushing all of the angels to stop you from igniting the pyre, and represents the true final boss of the game. In order to get to The Last Divinity, the requirement is you have to have a minimum of 100 shards in your run. So shards you're going to be collecting throughout the run. So if you look at the map, it's always going to come from these divine nodes. So you have divine boons, divine temples, divine hordes. Occasionally you can also get them from other means by duplicating items that or duplicating cards that have already been buffed with divine temple upgrades. You can also sometimes get them from cavern events, but regardless of how you get them, you need at least 100. And at 100, which is what we're at right now, 100 pack shards, this will put us into threat level medium against The Last Divinity. We'll talk about the higher threat levels in a little bit. But yeah, that's basically how you get here and a little bit of the background. Let's jump into the fight. As you can see already from the tooltip, The Last Divinity has different status effects on each floor and gains 7 damage when it gets into Relentless. Okay, so let's jump into the fight and talk a little bit about the structure here. So first thing is to look at The Last Divinity himself. So he is a big old boss man. He fills up the entire train, and similar to other flying bosses, he can be hit while he is there, and as he is everywhere, he can be hit at any time you have an open channel to the back line. He can also be targeted by spells. He can also be hit by sweep, trample, all the like, okay? And while he visually shows up as one giant boss, in reality, he is 3 different units that share a health pool, and that becomes very relevant. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, you can already see. So he's got 3 different parts. He's got his piercing gaze, which affects all units on the floor for sweep, 9 damage. 9 damage here at threat level medium. Then he has his 2 big arms that will 1-2 punch your units with multi-strike, starting with 7 damage. And then he has his feet, which will trample his foes for 11 damage. So those are the three different mechanics that happen on each floor. And again, these are 3 different units. They are 3 different units that have a shared health pool. In addition, all 3 floors have the same effect called Purify. After a debuff deals damage to this unit, remove that debuff. So this is the language here is very important. It means that only the debuff that deals the damage gets removed, not all debuffs. There was some confusion, I think, early on, where it was questions whether all debuffs would get removed every time you deal damage with the debuff. That is in fact not the case. So, and you can play any debuff onto the Last Divinity. So you can play, we have right here a Rail Beater. Rail Beater gives melee weakness. You can absolutely melee weakness Last Divinity. You can spell weakness Last Divinity. You can sap, daze, all of those things. And then when it comes to debuffs that deal damage, there are 2 of them. There is Frostbite and there's Reap. So whenever the Last Divinity takes Frostbite damage, whenever the Last Divinity takes Reap damage, all stacks of Frostbite and Reap get removed. Which may come off as a massive nerf to those, but I'll be honest, in practice, actually, you can make both work. You can make Frostbite and you can make Reap work. It's you have to play a little differently, but basically they can work just fine. But as I said, he operates as 3 different units, which means that status effects that you put onto one part of the Last Divinity do not affect the others. If I put Reap or Frostbite onto the top, the head, it doesn't affect the hands or the feet. Similar, if I put Daze onto one section of the Last Divinity, it does not affect the others as well. That's on the negative side, so your status effects are only going to affect the part of the Last Divinity you are fighting on that floor. On the positive side, there are also channelers that appear in his unit pool. Maybe we can start talking about that. So not only does Last Divinity do this ever-present damage, which, remember, increases by 7 once he gets into Relentless combat. This ever-present man here also continues to summon what is arguably the most difficult set of units throughout the game. Not even arguably, it is absolutely the most difficult set of units that you face in the game. And there's a lot of them. We'll talk about implications of that in a minute, but let's just start by playing out here. We're going to just play a very, very quick fight. We have a lot of modifiers here just to make it fast, but just to show, oh, hello lady of the house, you're going to be worthless. Let's just to show kind of how this battle operates here. We're just going to kind of get set up. Don't know why I'm playing that there. It honestly doesn't really matter that much. We're going to not play Lifesteal yet. But as I said, so now all of these parts of the Last Divinity are going to operate independently. They're always going to attack, but the health pool is shared, which is very relevant for, the fact that if you kill the Last Divinity on any floor, it kills the Last Divinity on all floors. Okay. Just going to continue to get through the fight here. And, okay, so first thing I want to mention is channelers. So any type of channeler will also affect the floor where the Last Divinity is. So currently, this channeler is granting spikes, which means that Last Divinity also has spikes. Let's bring down our Primordium here. And yeah, so that's the first thing I wanted to note, is that channelers do affect not only all the units on the floor, but also affect that part of the Last Divinity where it is. And again, you can see here that the hands and the head are not affected by the channeler's effect, which is only affecting the feet currently. Let's continue on. The next major difference between Last Divinity and other bosses is that he comes with his own bosses. So he is always going to summon a Ring 1 and a Ring 2 boss throughout the fight. We're going to try not to kill him too early here. I think we should be okay. Let's not get too crazy. Let's just get some heal on and continue. And these bosses always leave a Vengeful Shard. Nothing too important, but just something to note. And you can see not all enemies are affected by shards, but that changes the higher the pack shards is. You can see these ones are moderately affected. Obviously, if we were playing at a much higher pack shard level on an extreme threat level, then these would be powered up all the way, and you can see the indicator by how high the shards go. But if these were fully powered up, obviously it'd be a little bit more difficult, but should be just fine here. Continue to fight Last Divinity here. Again, we have a Channeler adding spikes, but the spike damage is not going to affect... well, it's going to affect Last Divinity. It's not going to affect the other pieces of the Last Divinity. And I think we're slowly closing in at the end of the fight here. Just trying to get enough lifesteal that we can manage to finish it off. Again, another boss. This is the Ring 2 boss that appeared in this case. It's going to be one of the two randomly. So you might get the Sweep boss, you might get the Steel Slate. So it's going to be different every fight. But you're guaranteed to get a Ring 1 boss and a Ring 2 boss every fight. And we're just closing in now on Relentless Combat, or on the end of the, onto the Relentless Combat, and then we'll talk about Relentless Combat. As long as we don't kill the Last Divinity, which it looks like we're not going to, that's absolutely perfect. Just play some lifesteal here. Okay, so then Relentless Combat. Relentless Combat works always from top to bottom. So he will do Relentless with your first floor, until he either dies or kills all of your units. Then he will do Relentless on the middle floor, again until he dies or until he's killed all the units, and then finishing off on the bottom floor. And you see here, we're getting the bottom floor kill now. So that's basically everything you need to know about the setup here. He summons a lot of units. He is actually 3 different units with a shared health pool. You can do status effects, but note that status effects that do damage are going to get purified after they deal their damage. And when he gets into... he does summon the 2 bosses. He's going to summon a Ring 1 boss and a Ring 2 boss. And then finally, he during Relentless, he will always start at the top floor until either he dies, the units die, same with the middle floor, and then finishing off with the bottom floor. Once all units have died, then he will start attacking the pyre. Okay? And again, he's also affected by pack shards. So you'll see when we get into the next threat levels that he's going to do a little bit more damage, and the units are going to become much stronger. So let's just finish off this fight. And there you go. There's the Last Divinity in a nutshell. Now, obviously, we were playing on easy mode here, even at Covenant level 25. But I think that gives a good overview of what the Last Divinity is like. Now we're going to jump over and look at him on some higher shard levels, and we can see how things are affected when you get into high and extreme threat levels. Okay, so we're at, once again, back to the Last Divinity. We have now a high threat level rather than a medium threat level. And so the first thing that's going to be obvious is that the higher threat level means more HP and more damage. And that's going to be, the damage is going to be true on all levels here. So each of the levels gets more damage. Overall, the Divinity himself gets more HP. And the units themselves also become a little bit stronger here. So we're going to quickly just play this one out. Hopefully we manage it without too many problems here. So even the bosses, the little mini bosses that get spawned, they're going to be a lot stronger. So just a lot more to deal with moving into the fight. But in general, the fight, even at a high threat level, is still operating more or less the same. It's not that different, just a little bit more difficult. Okay, and so then finally we have extreme level. So at extreme level, obviously even more health, up to 6,000 HP, even more damage, and the units are at full shards now, basically. So everything just gets obviously a lot harder. That's kind of the idea. And not much else to say about it. But yeah, so that's Last Divinity then, in terms of how he works, his mechanics. It's just big dude, split into 3 different units with a shared health pool, and you know, win or lose, you will always come back to this guy. So I think that's enough talking about the Divinity himself, the effects of the different shard levels. We can go into now more legitimate decks, right? I mean, this deck is kind of a cheese deck, right? Using mutators and stuff like that to try to get a really cheese win. We'll go into some of the builds that I did. We'll go into some of the runs, watch VODs of runs, which I did in the past, and just kind of talk about how to set up floors, why I set up in certain ways, and in general, the different styles of builds, and a little bit how to play them. Okay, first we're going to talk about single floor builds. So, I mean, a lot of builds end up, at least in when I play, I end up with a lot of single floor builds. You can do multiple floor builds, and we'll showcase a couple of those a little bit later on. But starting with single floor builds, this is actually the first build that I did that beat the Last Divinity once the DLC came out. And let's just have a look. So we have Spine Chief, granting extra charged echoes. We have a Guardian Stone, also enhanced with the Bogfly. We have a Nameless Siren, enhanced with the Siren of the Sea. And then we have just a bunch of spells. In particular, we have these double proclamations that both have massive damage and holdover. So really straightforward style here. We play tons of spells, we get tons of incants, we get tons of charged echoes, and we use those charged echoes to pull off massive proclamations for huge burst damage. So where would this floor go? Just as a prediction. What I ended up doing is playing this in the top floor. So why did I play this in the top floor versus other floors? Well, let's watch the VOD and talk about why the top floor setup makes the most sense here. Okay, so we play up on the top floor, and the main reason why this build makes sense in the top floor is, one, it's an incant build. So incant builds oftentimes need a lot of time to get set up, and you can see here, the goal is just to try to get as many spells played as possible so that we can generate the biggest first turn possible. What is one of the dangers of playing the top floor? Well, one of the major dangers of playing in the top floor is that you have the sweep effect. So if you don't have a proper way to sustain, you can get burst out by the sweep. In this case, we do have sustain because we are very shortly going to get our Guardian Stone, and the Siren has innate sustain because we merged her with a Siren of the Sea, which gives extra health every time we incant. So we'll wait a little bit. And then the other part that's really good about the top floor is these early proclamations get to hit directly onto the Last Divinity. Also, I just realized we also had a Daze. So between the Daze and the Armor Sustain, you need something like that. You need Sustain, you need Daze, you need Armor, Sap can also work, but you need a very consistent way to guarantee that you're not going to just get burst out by the sweep on the Last Divinity. And then if you can, top floor is almost always the best answer just in terms of timing. You have plenty, or you have more time than with the other floors to actually prep. So getting all of your priority units out, in this case incanting a lot, and all that's going to be really valuable. But again, the catch is, can you actually sustain through the damage? This is again a pretty good example of a top floor setup using incant and daze to ensure that our units are going to survive all the way up until relentless combat. Next, we have an example of a bottom floor setup, one type of bottom floor setup. So why is this one on the bottom? Well, the primary reason is just lack of guaranteed sustain. We do have a daze with Frenzied Swarm, which will occasionally hit. We do have a little bit of healing, but the big concern was the Nameless Siren getting killed very early. So rather than take the risk and set up on the top floor, we set up on the bottom, and you can we'll switch over to the VOD and we can show a little bit how that ended up working out. Okay, so here we are. We're gonna set up again on the bottom floor. The idea is the Sentient can take all the hits. The Nameless Siren can be more or less protected throughout the entire fight, and we're using regen in order to keep the Sentient alive, but we can just rely on the regular armor ticks we're getting on the Nameless Siren. And because we have a build here that does a lot of burst, we have an explosive Sentient here, we can kind of get away with this bottom floor build. You'll see this here because we do so many restoration triggers or rejuvenation triggers that we are absolutely able to just kind of burst down the entire bottom floor. And that's really the big thing. So with bottom floor setups, you need to have very early and consistent burst or AoE in order to make them work consistently. Again, otherwise you'd want to play in the middle or top floor where you have a little bit more time. Here, yeah, we did leak a couple of units, but it's not so critical. And the scaling is, while it's important to the build, the rejuvenation triggers can handle a lot of the scaling or even a lot of the damage throughout most of the run, that it's not too big of a concern for us. And so again, with most setups, I would say you try to go on the top floor with a setup like this, where we don't really have a lot of sustain on our middle and backliner necessarily. Try to play on the bottom floor. It's certainly the floor that takes the least amount of damage from the Last Divinity, but the caveat is you really need to have a build that can set up and can burst very quickly with solid AoE, solid frontline bursts, so you're not going to just die to units hitting your pyre. Okay, so then the last single floor setup we're going to look at is this Umbra with Penumbra build and Hellhorn, where we set up on the middle floor. And why do we set up on the middle floor? Well, one, we had Mind Jacks, so that already eliminates the major issue of the middle floor. And I would say if you can play on the middle floor, it's great. Oftentimes you don't, because at least in the way that I play, I'm building around capacity constraints. So unless I get something like Mind Jacks or some other way to consistently increase capacity, Wingmaker, Heft, something like that, it's middle floor is often going to be a detriment because you can't fit all the units that you've kind of set up. And capacity, I think, in general has become much more important in the Last Divinity, even than it was in the base game. But as I said, given that we already had Mind Jacks and we have also Architect's Penumbra, we can justify playing on the middle floor. This gives us a little bit of time without also hitting us with Ember Drain. And as well, we have a Horned Warrior, we have one Crucible Collector is going to be our main tank, but Penumbra and Horned Warrior aren't going to sustain through the sweep on the top floor. So then the middle floor becomes the best option. It gives us one more turn to set up and allows us to also play all of our units and take advantage of the Mind Jacks. And we can go jump into the VOD and just take a look about how this setup was kind of working. Okay, so you can see already we're setting up on the middle floor. Again, giving us a little bit more time to set up, using some of our AoE spells, in particular the Blessed Sword, to kind of clear out the bottom floor. And again, the whole idea here is just taking advantage of those Mind Jacks and as well buying as much time as possible. So in terms of like my preference, typically the way that I go through it in my logic is, can I play on the top floor? If I can play on the top floor, I do. And playing the top floor means I can consistently daze, sap, or any other ways reduce the sweep effect, or I can sustain. I can consistently sustain all my units through the Last Divinity. So in particular, a build like this as well, another reason, even if the other units had been able to survive, your morsels aren't. Unless you can actually sap or daze the Last Divinity, your morsels are just going to get wiped over and over again unless you have like morsel relics that protect them. So again here, a setup in the middle makes a lot of sense. But yeah, so it's top floor for me, and then if I can't play in the top floor, then I ask myself, can I play in the bottom floor? In order to play on the bottom floor, I need to have very early wave clear, very early burst damage. And if I don't have either of those, if I can't clear backliners, and if I can't do burst, then I have to consider going in a middle floor setup. And that may mean that I have to consider building my deck around middle floor capacity with that capacity reduction. Or, you know, in this case, you get lucky, you get a Mind Jax, you have an Architect, Penumbra, and you're able to still play out all your stuff even though you have limited capacity. All right, now let's jump into some multi-floor setups. First multi-floor setup we're going to look at is a Little Icarus build. So here we have Little Fade, Little Icarus, getting a lot of spikes and damage. We have a whole bunch of Spike Driver colonies. We have an Animus of Will, we have a Wickless Tycoon, we have a Formless Child, and we have then a bunch of spells. Mostly moldings, or molded, primitive molds, root seeds. And then a couple other things just to throw in there, Engulfed in Smoke and Bramble-Ash. So why does this work as a multiple floor setup? Well, first off, we just have a lot of units, right? If you look at total capacity, we have 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 capacity worth of units. Not all of them are priority units. We only have Animus of Will and Wickless Tycoon as our priority units, but just a lot of capacity that we need to fill up. The other nice thing about this is that they're all zero cost, so we're not concerned so much about you know, having to spend a lot of Ember to get these guys out. A lot of them are going to be free or zero cost, and that's going to make it a little bit easier to play all these things out. So let's go into the run, and we can look at exactly how we coordinate this kind of multi-floor setup here. So we decided to play Little Fade on the bottom. The idea of playing the first floor on the bottom is simply that we want to try to kill everything that we can, and we certainly cannot set up at all on the top floor because our Spike Driver colonies are just going to get killed by the sweep. So we set everything up on the bottom floor. We try to kill off as many early units as we can. We're going to be playing some of these Spike Driver colonies as well. We did play the Animus here, but to be honest, she's only there temporarily. In the end, we're going to be playing the Wickless Baron and our Animus on the middle floor, and they're going to act as cleanup duty and then just kind of a little bit of sustained damage onto the Last Divinity throughout the entire fight. So again, we're going to bring back our Little Fade. We're going to take advantage of Formless Child as another way to reform. But the whole idea here, again, is just try to kill everything off on the bottom floor, and whatever leaks is going to get taken care of by our middle floor. And in the meantime, we just try to stack up as much damage as possible. You can kind of see how this is playing out, right? So we have basically a pretty solid clear on the bottom because of all the multi-strikes and because of Little Fade's spikes. And then now I think we're going to try to get rid of the Animus of Will, or she might actually burn out naturally anyway. And then, yeah, maybe we put a couple Spike Driver colonies other places. But basically the idea here is just to stack all of our big damage on the bottom, and then that middle floor becomes just an alternative floor to use up that extra capacity of units that we have, as well as, yeah, try to get some just general damage and cleanup duty. Okay, so the last build we're going to look at is a Melting Remnant build, or an Umbra Melting Remnant build. This is one of the most complex builds I've ever ran. And it was a multiple floor setup, but it was very different because it was a dynamic multiple floor. Our units are constantly changing positions, we're moving things around, with the idea to try to make sure we're not going to die to units. Like the long-term sustain wasn't so much of an issue, it was more making sure we're killing off all of the spawns before they reach the pyre. So what made this so complex? Well, first off, we have Primordium, and the idea with this build was to actually have Primordium die, bring back Primordium, and then take advantage of all of the reform extra stats you get from reforming Primordium. In addition, we have 2 endless Votivaries that are scaling due to due to resin block. So every time these Votivaries die, they're scaling up, and they're dying every turn. We have an Entombed Explosive that does both AoE and burst, and will get reformed multiple times. We have Shadow Eater, who is going to Gorge to do AoE. We have Crucible Collector, who is our kind of sustained long-term damage. And then we have a bunch of spells, a lot of morsel generation with packed morsels. We have primitive molds and a molded and a wicked blaze to make sure we can constantly bring back this Entombed Explosive and also Primordium. And then a little bit of kind of like other stuff mixed in to just space prisms to get more space, and then so on. I'm not going to show the whole fight. Highly recommend you check out this fight in particular, because I think it's really interesting and kind of showcases how complex tactical combat can be with the Last Divinity. I'm just going to show a little bit, a few moments in the fight that I think are particularly interesting, and then we'll kind of give some closing thoughts on the Last Divinity fight. So the start of the fight, we already decided, because it's a morsel build, we can't really play our morsel or gorgers on the top floor. So we're going to be doing a middle floor, bottom floor setup, but we are going to flex our Votivaries and our Entombed Explosives around in order to try to deal with the spawns before they reach the top floor. We get a kind of worthless branded warrior out of our conscription. It's okay. And now the goal is, again, trying to set up in a way that is going to kill the most units possible. So we're going to do some AoE damage. We're going to put some extra stats onto Primordium so that when Primordium dies, it gets reformed. It's going to maintain all of those stats. And you're going to just see a lot of little pivoting moments. So let's jump ahead a little bit forward. Okay, so we're now on the second round. We're going to get our Shadow Eater out. And a lot of this is calculation, trying to calculate how much damage the enemies are going to do, because we really don't want Shadow Eater or the Crucible Collector to die. Those are the 2 units that cannot die. Everything else can die. Primordium can die, the Votivaries can die, obviously the Entombed Explosive you want to die. But these 2 main units, they have to survive. They are the core of this build. And so again, it's a lot of math. We're trying to figure out where do we want this damage shield to go, because we get damage shield when we play units due to our artifact, Chain of Gems. So now it's like, do we need it on Shadow Eater? Do we need it on something that's going to block for the Crucible Collector, who's currently dying? And again, trying to maximize the use of our artifacts, maximize our units, knowing that we're having to kind of play this multi-floor setup, and also make sure we're killing off all of the different spawns here. I think we end up playing, let's see, what does it look like in the end? Just kind of pass forward. Okay, so we did play Shadow Eater to get the damage shield. We're going to be blocking with Votavary, who is going to keep our Crucible Warden just barely alive. And then now it's all about trying to get as much gorging as we can to get AoE. And luckily this was a build where we had plenty of morsels we could use. We had merged a Morsel Master onto the Crucible Collector. So the Crucible Collector gets to double up the morsels that you play there. And then our Shadow Eater, we just tried to maximize as much as possible the AoE damage, because we just don't want things, especially we don't want backliners making it to the pyre. Let's shift forward a little bit more. So this was another one of those pivotal moments where we were trying to decide where to play Primordium, because Primordium had so far in the run been mostly used to do the Crucible Collector, but at this point it kind of made sense to pivot, move our Primordium to the bottom so that we could have guaranteed AoE on the bottom floor. So we kind of had to change up the strategy last minute with the idea that we switch Primordium, put it on a different floor in order to take advantage of the AoE, and as well to get some damage onto Shadow Eater with the long-term goal of making sure we are killing as much of the units on the bottom as possible before they reach the higher floors and then start putting the pyre in danger. We're going to skip forward just one last time. Okay, so we reach what I would say was one of the pivotal moments in this run. we have a floor that if it reaches the pyre, it's going to kill us. So we have to, it's mandatory that we stop this floor. In addition, we have Primordium back, and the question is, where do we play Primordium? We had Primordium on the bottom to gorge for a few times before it burned out. Now the question is, where do we want it long term? And this is now set up where we have to find a combination of putting Primordium in the right spot, getting enough AoE to prevent more floors like this ending up on the top floor, but also addressing the elephant in the room, which is this big problem with all these units up top. And so shifting units around, I think we ended up playing, the other part we're trying to also consider is where's the best place to put our damage shield among our units. We have 4 units to play, or morsels that can get damage shield. I think in the end, yeah, we played it over here to keep Primordium alive longest. And we can skip forward just a little bit. I think I'm still puzzling it out. Okay, so I think I had puzzled it out. So we said Votivary because we needed a little hit from Votivary. We put the second Votivary in because then it does burst. And you can see we knocked that guy, we killed the first guy, we almost killed the backliner, and we knocked the middle unit to where it's only doing 1 damage to us. So basically we're able to address the top floor, and then now it's all about how do we want to play out these lower floors to make sure we're not creating a future problem that we also have to deal with. And so the first decision then is, I mean, we're going to put morsels on the bottom. That's going to be clear because the morsels are going to clear out those stealth backliners. I think we ended up playing Primordium here. Yeah, we did, so that we could start getting huge damage in preparation for Relentless and also to deal with bosses. Because that is a problem right now, is that Shadow Eater can't actually hit the bosses because there's always a front unit before Shadow Eater can hit it. So then we want to start stacking onto our Crucible Collector instead, so the Crucible Collector can kill the big boss units while the Shadow Eater does AoE. So again, check out the entire run because I think this one is a really good showcase of how to do this fight when you have a build that is not guaranteed to win and is a little bit more complex. And with that, we are finished with this guide on the Last Divinity. I hope this was helpful for you. I hope to give you some ideas about different ways that you can play. Again, if you want more ideas about builds, check out the runs that I've done so far. I will be doing some build guides in the future as well, either highlighting specific builds or highlighting specific champion paths. But in general, I mean, I think this fight is really interesting. I think it adds a whole new dynamic to the game. If you are playing on the DLC, I hope you're enjoying it. I certainly am. For having more than 1,500 hours into this game, still finding a lot of fun with it, and I hope you guys are enjoying it as well. If you did like this video, if you found it helpful, if it's helping you to get some more Last Divinity kills, please subscribe. I mean, I don't want to go too much, but one thing I don't know if you're aware is YouTube monetization has a kind of minimum barrier, which is 1,000 subscribers, and we're almost there. We're more than halfway, more than 2/3 of the way there. So if you haven't subscribed yet and you've had any help from any of these guys, I ask you to subscribe. It means a lot to me. Hitting that 1K threshold makes a big difference in terms of what I can do with YouTube and how much time I can dedicate to the channel. Yeah, otherwise, like, comment, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you again.